Anybody? Yes, sir. John?
President Boger, what is your evaluation of the possibilities of increased per capita income throughout the world in the developing countries, contrasted with population growth? It seems to me that most of the recent real increases in demand for food have come from increased per capita incomes
Mm-hmm.
among the recently developing countries. And as that goes ahead, this could really put a stress on our food supplies.
Yes, that's true. As I stated in the paper and did not dwell on it much, you really can't solve the food problem without solving the poverty problem. And when you solve the poverty problem, you're putting stresses and strain on the food problem. I understand that, but I also believe that if we greatly expand our investment in research, and I'd say especially on research problems in the torrid zone of this world, that we can probably keep up with the demand for food that comes from rising incomes in the developing countries. It's only been recently that there's been investment in research that's mission-oriented in the torrid zones. I mentioned we're in the temperate zone, and there's another one on the opposite end or side of the world. But this vast area of the tropics really has been lacking in research. And that's one of the contributions, I think, that some of the international research institutes is demonstrating the need to generalize from their experiences on a much broader base to the countries either side of the equator around the world. Potential's there. And I didn't say anything about farming the seas and all that. If we really want to get serious, there's potential there too that can be exploited. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Boger, you made a statement earlier about using food as a foreign policy
Yes.
device, and there's some people, this is my opinion, but there's some people who I've heard say that, food shouldn't be used in politics because it can be used like nuclear weapons, You won't get any food unless you come to our side. And a lot of people are afraid that's what's going to happen if you bring food in there. What do you say about that?
Well, I think that's a very good point. And it's a point where there is some controversy, but I personally believe that instead of imposing an embargo on shipments of grain to Russia, we should have continued with our commitment there and expanded it. And the more interrelated, interdependent that we become, I think the less danger there is of war and the more likelihood of peace. Now, that just happens to be my position. Now, if you overtly developed it in a way so that you forced dependency and then used it as a threat in order to exploit those countries, then that is not consistent with my thinking. But it's there, and I know it, and I know there's fear on the other side that that's the way it would work. And again, I just say, in terms of the third world countries, as I mentioned in the paper, we have, in my opinion, an obligation to help them develop their food production capability and become more self-reliant, as I put it, more self-sustaining and less dependent upon, say, exports from here or other places where there's surpluses today. Yes, sir.
How do we overcome political systems to help enhance our research? Such a potential feed for them to feed themselves. For example, in Latin America, visiting Guatemala, such an immense potential for them to feed themselves, and yet political situation there, and our own political situation, forcing our own views, enhancing our own viewpoint,
Well, uh, as was mentioned in my introduction, and I'm sure Iowa State University has experienced this. I haven't experienced it yet at Oklahoma State, but at Michigan State several times when we had programs of all kinds rolling in a country, when all of a sudden the political environment changed and we were exiled. I don't know how many countries, but I suppose 4 or 5 countries that we had programs with ended up that way, and we had to figure out how to bring people home or bank them in neutral territory until the situation changed. Frankly, I don't think that it's a business of the research organizations, public research organizations on, well, let's say in this country, to get involved with that sort of thing abroad. Now, we'll leave that to the State Department and some others, and I realize that you get all linked up and you can't completely disassociate from them. But I think we have to be as politically neutral with these activities in other countries as we try to keep research and educational programs in this country. That is nonpartisan, both sides. We're all interested in food. And in some political climates, it's easy. In others, it's very, very difficult. But except for a few areas of the world, I still think it's possible to overcome these and stay more or less neutral as research and educational institutions. Now, if you're trying to build indigenous institutions, then you do have a problem because, again, we've had some fairly viable operations going that a change in government wiped out in one fell swoop, and years and years and years of research progress went down the drain. And that's unfortunate because people have their expectations built and are building infrastructures to accommodate gains that have been made and the prospects of expanded application of the results, and the rug gets pulled out from under them, and they suffer more than they would have maybe had they never gotten started with some of those. But it's a risk you take, and I think it's one still worth taking for us. Yes, sir?
I think within our land grant systems, we should have specific programs in food areas for international students who come to this country, particularly for graduate education.
Yes, I do. Indeed, I do. And to the extent that we can accommodate them here with environmentally controlled experimental facilities, then I think we should figure out some way to accommodate that research activity in the home country or in an environment similar to the home country, even if it takes Iowa State professors out of Ames, Iowa to do it. And if we think about this a little bit, I think there are ways to accommodate that, and it helps immeasurably. I think Cornell's experience in the Philippines is a good example. And at Michigan State, we were able to, well, let me not get back to an institution that I had anything to do with, but the Ford Foundation program in Argentina was a very good one. They sponsored, I think, 30 PhDs in agriculture over a period of a few years, and every one of them wrote a thesis that was applicable to the home environment. Many of them went back and did it. And then you say, well, how do you conduct the final exams? Well, they brought them back to the States, or they sent the committee down and got it done. I think that's very important. Yes, ma'am?
Do you think that measures to control population growth should play a role in solving world food
Uh, that's a tough one. When you say measures to control population, I guess I would go to the family planning concept and educational programs that might be helpful. I watched a lot of these activities, educational efforts in Pakistan. That was when Pakistan was east and west and not Bangladesh and Pakistan. And I think that those programs were beginning to make their mark, and I think pretty well received. Yet I know how difficult it is in certain environments in order to get these programs in place and functional to the point where you're actually having an impact on the rate of population growth. I guess my feeling is people really ought to understand the consequences of their actions, and then if they overtly make decisions that go counter to that, then at least they understand what they are. And there's, like I said, I wouldn't do it just so we had enough food to go around, because we aren't gonna feed any more people than there are, and we aren't going to have any more people than we can feed. That's a simplistic statement that I made that is so true. But the deal is, can we improve nutrition? Can we extend the value of human capital by extending lifespans and by keeping more alive that are born? And if we can, I think, and are successful in improving income levels in countries, that there are voluntary programs then that will put some checks on population. I would like to think that we don't have to have wars and famine and all that in order to do it on a widespread basis, but we'll probably continue to have that too. Another question? Oh, over here. Yes, ma'am.
How much do you expect the new administration to influence the research of land-grant universities, and how much do you think you will have to depend upon multinational and national corporations for research?
Well, on the new administration, the way that research would be impacted would likely be through general constraints on government spending. But high priority in the scheme of things from all those that I've had any conversation with is certain kinds of research activities that will lead to increased productivity in the United States, and agricultural productivity is something that needs to be increased as one category, along with transportation and along with general improvements in productivity in industry and so on. And I heard one person not too long ago remark that thought that we might even have more resources in the current administration than we've had in the immediate past. After all, the last administration hadn't done too well except to turn around the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health a little bit. But I think we'll see probably as good a treatment in the next 10 years as we've had in the last 10 years, and of course the first 4 of it will be the new administration at least. Now, how much are we going to have to depend on multinational, national corporations? Well, I would hope not too much in terms of grants and contracts to institutions like ours, because I just don't think they'll ever be all that major. Many of them are in a position to do it themselves, and they do it with selfish interest, not always in the public interest. And I think that the lion's share will continue to be administered by them and not through some other entities such as land-grant universities. Yes, sir?
You touched quite
Sure.
food production. What's not available is, for example, fertilizer or resources to get the improved seed. It's not that farmers or people, extension workers don't know. They know they can do it, but just resources are not there. Just fertilizer is not available.
Sure. Well, that's a very serious problem. And of course, developing the infrastructure for the distribution of the needed inputs as well as the distribution of the output becomes a very serious problem. And I would just say that we shouldn't view it as a hopeless situation. We should view it positively, and you do a little bit here and there, and pretty soon it gets generalized on a broader basis than maybe you ever imagined it could be. And there are some case illustrations like that. Yes, sir, JT?
Early on in your talk, President Boger, you mentioned the fact that you didn't think we'd ever be without poverty or without food problems.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I didn't state that we wouldn't be without poverty, but you got to solve the poverty problem to solve the food problem. And then, as John mentioned, you know, there are some negatives with that because you increase incomes, you increase demand, and then create more shortages. But what I said was I do not think we'll ever be without malnutrition, hunger, and yes, even starvation. My hope is that through positive efforts we can reduce the amount and minimize the impact of it. And that's about it. And one of the reasons is tied in with the question over here. I honestly do not believe that we're going to have the positive checks on, or the preventive checks on population growth that will keep population from expanding if you expand the food supply. And so always out there at the margin, you're going to have these problems. Also, I think if you solve it in the aggregate, you aren't going to solve the distribution problem, and that's a part of the question over here. But here again, see, I started with the premise that I think it's good to be able to sustain more people on this earth and to always put up with what we're going to have to put up with out here in terms of malnutrition, hunger, and starvation, than it is to just cut it off and say, okay, we'll have it, and we'll have 4.2 billion people on this earth, and that'll be it. I honestly believe that you can increase the quality of life and enhance civilization, culture, for large numbers, or, well, let's say larger numbers of people in the future than maybe we've even projected to the year 2000 if we want to do it. And I say it's worth it. But some may disagree with that. Some may say, well, you get that many, you can't organize society so they can live with each other, and maybe that's true. Yes, sir. Should we take one more, maybe? Okay. Yes. Yes, and there's some very good case illustrations where that's happened already with our aid efforts. We have wheat-consuming nations now that were once purely rice-consuming nations, and it's made a difference. Yeah, but also you can do other things. You know, take the high lysine corn example and improving the quantity of protein in the diet for those peoples who eat a high percentage of corn in their diet. And you know, that's Central America, and it's quite a story. That sort of thing can be replicated too. It's not changing dietary habits, but it's working with what you have to improve nutritional standards. Well, there are still some hands, and I think it's probably obvious to all of you that I have presented to you some of my own thoughts, some of my own opinions, and they're heavily weighted by my own personal set of values. And I also have to admit that although my field was agricultural economics, and I at one time thought I was a pretty good student of agriculture, that I've been out of this business for some time, and I may be just a little bit dated. And as I look at some of the people here in the audience, those of you who work day by day in these scientific fields, or you keep up with the state of science and the state of the art generally, you may think I've over-exaggerated or under-exaggerated, but I hope that I haven't said too much that will cause thought processes to go astray, and with intelligent people, I don't think that will happen. But from my standpoint, let me just say that it was good to make the commitment and force myself to do some research and thinking and updating on the topic, and it's great to be back on the campus at Iowa State University and to see so many fine things going on in physical plant with people. And if you could just now have those same good things happening with your financial base, nothing will stop you. Thank you. You've been a very good audience.
We thank you, President Bogert, for contributing to our institute. And I thank you all for attending.